Iran is the country that has stood up the most for the Palestine cause. What do you make of the current situation of the Iran war after the assassination of Ayatollah Khamenei and Iran's nuclear program?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Yeah, it's good to be back here and to have to have this opportunity to talk about Iran. I think it's a important thing to do because I think a lot of people are horrified by the last couple of weeks, and I feel that there is sort of some responsibility on us to sort of produce some content about this. I can see that even within a day or two of Trump's war, various people felt so demoralized by the state of the world that they just disabled their social media because they kind of couldn't cope with what they were seeing. And I feel that there's an obligation on us to try to make sense of what's happening and talk about it a little, even though it may lead us to not very optimistic conclusions at the superficial level. But by hopefully creating some order around it, it helps others see it and regulate around it. I think one of the first things to capture is, with the Iran situation, that we're in quite a strange world, because there is, of course, the Iranian leader who's passed away, and then there's the Iranian leadership, and then there's the Iranian sort of government, which I would define more widely to be also the institutions and probably the security and military apparatus. But then there's also the Iran as a country. And I think a lot of people probably overwhelmingly feel sympathy with Iran as a country at the moment, regardless of how they shape themselves politically on something like the Iranian government or the late Iranian leader. And I think also it's impossible not to contextualize this in the Gaza genocide, because people know very well that, even if people don't know very well that Iran has a history of supporting Hamas, for example, people know very well that Israel's going after Iran, and Israel also committed genocide against the Palestinians. So it falls in this. And I think this puts us in a sense of the world where people feel like, oh, the Americans and Israelis are at it again, and the Gaza genocide vibe is back, but now it's at Iran. And I think that's the sense that people broadly have, and I think that is the correct sense. That is essentially what is happening here, and that's why people feel disempowered and switch off. I think one of the really important things to say, moving beyond these simplifications and essentializations, is that if we start digging into Iran and Israel and the US and the nuclear agreement, Iran actually, firstly, is subject in its sort of external renderings in the Western world to, of course, like racism and propaganda and all of the usual tropes and all the rest of it. One of the most important things about the real sort of reality of Iran is that actually it's been in a position, broadly speaking, of what's called strategic patience, which in the month of Ramadan is quite an interesting sort of vibe to note. But basically, Iran is a neighbor, not immediately, of the Israelis. And in a sense, Israel is like the kid in the playground whose parents have given him drugs and a taser and a baseball bat. And this kid just basically goes around and smashes up anyone whenever he feels like it. And the Iranian approach to this has been to sort of lie low, but try to be as sort of patient strategically in the region as possible. So the image that we have of Iran, that it's this kind of terror regime that has been, you know, sowing havoc in the Middle East and has threatened Israel and threatened all these Westerners living in Dubai and all the rest of it, is basically a big BS. That's one of the main things to say. And it's a very essential comment to make, but basically there was no threat from Iran. Iran hasn't invaded anyone. It wasn't going to invade anyone. And so, in a sense, to slightly exaggerate it rhetorically for a second, but Iran is like the quiet kid in the corner who's been minding his own business to an extent, and they've decided to go after him now. So far from posing an immediate threat to the Israelis or Americans, they've gone after Iran and started a fight. A question of how that all manifests and where that goes is a separate one, but I think it's really important to talk about the Iranian strategic patience, because that just illuminates that this is a regime that carefully thinks things through, whereas the Israelis and Americans act with the hubris of not thinking things through to the same extent. So there's this sort of disparity there. And I think that, just to zoom back out to the macro picture for a second, starting to put what's happening in some sense and context, I think it's the feeling that after Venezuela, and also here speaking in Southeast Asia, having been to Vietnam recently, it's impossible to not put it in the context that this is essentially the Americans and Israelis going after anyone that's in their way of their global power ambitions, really. Anyone that they can go after, they will. They can't really go after China and Russia, so they go after everyone else. And I think people have a sense that, oh, this is just, another tragic episode of sort of American-Israeli imperial hubris, just knocking over another country and another stable society or whatever. And I mentioned Vietnam because, in a sense, it's impossible not to see this through the lens of economics, and that the Americans, will go after anyone, just like with Cuba, that doesn't, follow their financial model. So in this sense, they're sort of going after the capitalist empire. But with the Israelis, it's not as economic. It's also ideological. It has religious sort of undertones, if not overtones. And both of them speak to the kind of cancerous infinite growth mindset that is like sort of the worst of human civilization. The war in Iran just represents the latest episode of that. So that's how I see it. So in a sense, it's not really about Iran for being Iran at all. It's very much this imperial hubris needed a new vent, and this is the latest surface and war theatre for it.